The sea was restless that morning, the sky the color of pewter. The men of the 29th Infantry Division stood shoulder to shoulder on the deck of the Empire Javelin, watching the gray line of France faint from the mist. You could feel it in your stomach, the weight of history pressing down before a single shot was fired. The ship rolled hard in the channel, and every clang of metal sounded like the clock ticking toward destiny. The order came to board the landing craft. They called them LCAs, low, thin-sided boats meant to carry men straight into chaos. The water below was heaving 4, maybe 5 feet at a time. A man in front misjudged the drop from the ladder and shattered his leg against the side. He was hauled back up on a rope, groaning. There was no pause. The next man stepped forward. A heartbeat later, boots hit steel, and the sea spray soaked everything. He found himself wedged on the starboard side, knees against the ramp, rifle across his chest, eyes locked on the horizon. They circled for what felt like forever. The coxswain shouted above the engines, and the little craft turned toward shore. 10 miles out, they could see the sky light up, the big guns from the Texas and the rocket ships pounding the coast. Every burst painted the water orange. The men cheered. For a moment they believed it might be easy. Then another boat vanished beside them, swamped, gone in seconds. The men in the next craft over pulled survivors from the water. Nobody spoke. The realization settled in. The sea itself was claiming soldiers before the beach ever could. When they finally turned toward Dog Red Beach, the world went deafening. Machine gun tracers stitched across the surf. Shells clawed the water into geysers. Their boat scraped the hull of another, hit a sandbar, and lurched sideways. The command came to go now. The ramp dropped, and men spilled forward into waist-deep water. He shed everything heavy, vest, pack, gear, until only the helmet stayed tied under his chin. Around him the water churned red and black with oil from burning tanks. He fought for air, pushing toward the shallows, dragging a limp body with one arm because instinct told him not to let another man sink. It haunted him later, the fact that survival sometimes demands terrible choices. But on that beach, thought didn't exist, only movement. His knees hit sand. He crawled behind an iron barrier twisted with barbed wire. Bullets ricocheted like hornets over his head. A mortar burst somewhere behind him, rattling the earth. He looked up at the gray sky and did the only thing left to do. He prayed. He promised God that if he lived, he'd spend the rest of his life doing whatever purpose awaited him. Almost at once, smoke drifted across the beach, thick, white, rolling in from the naval guns farther down the coast. And for the first time that day, there was cover. A voice cut through the haze. 29, let's go! It was Colonel Cannon. The order electrified everyone. They ran, stumbling, slipping, half-crawling up the slope toward the berm. How any of them made it that far, none could later explain. He reached the ridge, soaked and shaking, lungs on fire but still breathing. That was victory enough. They regrouped near the dunes, a few dozen men who barely knew each other. Some had lost rifles and others helmets. They had one mission: to reach the village of Vierville. They moved low along the sand for nearly an hour, inch by inch, until concrete walls blocked their path. Explosives later cleared that way, but for now they found gaps in wire, crawled through mud, and followed the sound of distant shouting. By mid-morning they reached the outskirts of the town. A French villager waved them onward, guiding them between stone walls toward the church that had been their original objective. The steeple was gone, blown apart by naval fire, but the mission remained. They ducked into alleys, nerves shot, hearts pounding with every echo of gunfire. Then came the worst realization of all. The rounds cracking over their heads weren't from the enemy. It was friendly fire from the ships offshore. The sergeant yelled for someone with radio experience to run back to the beach and get a set. Without communication, they were targets of their own side. He volunteered. He retraced his path alone. The Frenchman who'd helped them smiled faintly, gave a thumbs up, and disappeared back into the smoke. The road sloped down toward the sea, and the full scale of the morning hit him. The smell of salt and fuel, the burning armor still belching black smoke. The beach was a graveyard of machines. He looked for a radio operator, someone, anyone still transmitting. An LCI had just come in, men pouring out under fire. Then he spotted a young soldier with a radio pack struggling up the sand. Relief flooded in. He thought, there's my lifeline. He started toward him. They were maybe 40 yards apart when the air cracked. A burst exploded overhead. The blast threw both men down. The radio was gone, shredded. He and a medic rushed forward through the smoke. The young soldier was still, the device useless. They tried to pull him to safety, but another shell landed close enough to send shrapnel slicing through the sand. He felt something tear across his own leg. The medic cried out, clutching his arm. They kept dragging until they reached the berm, both of them shaking, both knowing they'd just seen more than they could ever explain. Night came. The tide rolled in. He lay under that ridge, wounded but alive, listening to the endless percussion of war. He thought of the boy with the radio, of the faces he'd seen vanish into the surf, of promises whispered to God only hours earlier. And when the sun finally rose over Normandy, he realized that D-Day hadn't ended. It had only begun to see him next. That was his landing. That was the longest day. Dawn came slow the next morning, thin gray light stretching across the coast like smoke that refused to fade. The sea behind him looked calm again, almost gentle, as if it hadn't devoured half the men who crossed it only hours before. He pushed himself upright against the berm, leg throbbing. Uniform stiff with salt and sand. The tide had swallowed the wreckage in slunts, leaving only bits of debris drifting at the water's edge. All along the beach, shapes began to move, figures crawling out from the mist, coughing, calling to one another. No one could tell who was who yet. The insignias were caked in grime, faces hidden behind soot. They just nodded, half in disbelief, half in acknowledgement that they were still breathing. A medic made his way down the line, arm bound in a sling, carrying a small pouch of morphine and bandages. He checked wounds in near silence, the only sounds the gulls and the faint pop of gunfire somewhere inland. When he reached him, the man shook his head. "You can walk?" he asked. A nod. "Then keep moving. The longer you stay, the harder it gets." That was the rule on D-Day. Motion was life. He gathered what he could, an abandoned rifle, a half-empty canteen, and started toward Vierville. The path was rough, full of twisted metal and cratered sand. Every few yards, a helmet or a boot half buried in mud marked the trail of the men who hadn't made it. The smell of fuel clung to everything. He tried not to breathe through his nose. Half a mile up, he caught sight of others regrouping. Tired faces pressed together behind a knocked-over tank. Their voices were hushed but steady. A sergeant pointed toward the cliffs. "We move at dusk. Rangers cleared a gap by the D1 draw. We'll use that." So they waited. For hours they crouched under the faint cover of the dune, listening to artillery rumble like distant thunder. Someone passed around a tin of crackers from a K ration. Another man tore it in half and handed the rest wordlessly to whoever reached next. In that quiet, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by something heavier. A cold awareness that this was only the first step in a much longer road. When the order finally came, they rose in near unison. Bent low, they advanced inland, through fields that still smelled of smoke. The hedgerows loomed high on both sides, thick with brush. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rattle of gear made hearts jump. But there was purpose now. Somewhere up ahead, a church steeple jutted from the horizon like a signpost. That was Vierville. That was the goal. As they approached the outskirts, a small farmhouse came into view. Roof half collapsed, windows shattered. A French family had hidden in the cellar, faces pale, eyes wide when they saw the uniforms. One of the soldiers spoke a little French, enough to calm them, enough to ask which direction the enemy had gone. The father pointed down the road, shaking his head, whispering, "Pas de bons hommes," no good men. The villagers had been living between two armies for years. They knew what silence really meant. Beyond the farmhouse, gunfire cracked again. They dropped into a ditch, hugging the earth as dust sprayed over them. When the shots stopped, they moved, fast, deliberate, ducking from stone wall to wall until they reached the center of the village. The church was a ruin, its bell twisted, its steeple shattered by naval guns, but its stone walls still stood, and for a few hours that was enough to call it safety. Inside, a medic laid out supplies on the altar. A few wounded were carried in on doors torn from nearby houses. Someone passed a canteen, someone else whispered a prayer. The sounds outside had shifted, no longer the rolling chaos of the beach, but the sharp, methodical pulse of a battle beginning to settle. The men could hear the engines of Shermans grinding up from the shore, the rumble of artillery repositioning behind them. The invasion was holding. He stepped outside and looked down the slope toward the water. From this height, the whole coastline was visible. The endless ships, the gray clouds of smoke, the dots of movement still fighting for ground. It was impossible to believe that less than 24 hours ago, this had been untouched sand. Now it was the center of the world. A breeze carried the faint echo of church bells from another village farther inland. He thought about the promise he'd made on the beach, the one whispered to the sky amid chaos. He didn't know yet what forever meant. All he knew was that somehow he was still standing. And that was enough reason to keep walking. That night, they dug shallow trenches outside the town and waited for dawn. Somewhere in the darkness, voices murmured. German maybe, or maybe just nerves playing tricks. Every man stared toward the horizon, expecting another attack, another wave. But instead came a strange stillness, broken only by the rustle of wind through the hedges and the distant hum of engines offshore. He lay there, eyes open, hands trembling from exhaustion, and watched the stars crawl across the black sky. The thought came uninvited, but stayed anyway. That history, when it happens, doesn't feel grand. It feels small. Wet boots, empty stomach, sand in your teeth. It's the kind of story you can only understand decades later, when the world has had time to make sense of it. For now, it was just survival. And that was enough. Morning arrived pale and cold. The mist still hung over the hedgerows like breath on glass. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting, and looked across the fields. The beach was hidden now behind the slope, but the sound of the sea carried faintly, reminding them all where they'd come from. The men began to move with practiced exhaustion, checking rifles, tightening bandages, passing quiet words. The first real daylight since the landing showed the landscape for what it was. Not a battlefield, but farmland scarred by violence. A plow sat overturned near a ditch. A cow wandered loose between shell craters. Someone's laundry still hung from a line fluttering beside a burned-out truck. Orders came down the line. The 29th was pushing deeper inland toward Saint Laurent. The Rangers were moving parallel, clearing pockets of resistance. He joined a small unit sent ahead to scout the road. 6 men, weary but steady, they advanced through the hedgerows, rifles raised, the dew still thick on the grass. Every shadow felt alive. Every step forward was a gamble. They passed the remnants of another squad, faces they didn't know, uniforms torn, their weapons laid neatly beside them by those who had survived the night. No one spoke. You didn't talk much on days like that, you just kept moving. By mid-morning, they reached the top of a small ridge. Beyond it, the fields opened wide, patchwork green and gold stretching toward the horizon. In the distance, faint columns of smoke marked where the naval shells had struck. The sound of aircraft hummed overhead, friendly this time. Someone exhaled, almost smiling. "Looks like we made it." The words hung there for a long moment, because what did making it even mean? They had crossed the beach, climbed the ridge, and lived through the impossible. But each man carried something invisible now, a weight that wouldn't wash away with the tide. They set up near a farmhouse and waited for the next set of coordinates, and he sat on a broken fence post pulling a chocolate bar from a ration tin. The simple taste of it felt unreal, almost sacred. Around him others rested, some writing quick letters home, some just staring at nothing. One of the older sergeants knelt to light a cigarette, hands shaking. "You know," he said, "I keep thinking about how quiet it is." It was true. After the roar of ships and guns, the silence felt unnatural. The only sound was the rustling of trees and the distant crash of waves. Somewhere behind them, the Navy still shelled the far cliffs, but here, for the first time, there was calm. A courier arrived with a radio message, the first clear transmission since the beach. "Vierville secure. Allied forces advancing. Hold position." The men exhaled almost in unison. The invasion had succeeded. The foothold in Europe was real. He walked a few paces away toward the edge of the ridge and looked back toward the water. The beach that had once seemed endless now shimmered with movement. Vehicles unloading, medics tending to the wounded, engineers clearing obstacles. The great machine of liberation was in motion. He thought of the boy with the radio, the one he'd tried to save, the one whose name he'd never learned. That image would stay with him longer than any medal, longer than any speech or ceremony. Because history tends to remember the victory, but men remember the faces. That night, as they prepared to move again, he wrote in a small notebook he kept in his jacket. The pencil trembled as he wrote the first line, "If I forget this day, may the sea itself remind me." He closed it and tucked it away. Years later, he would tell the story not with pride, but with reverence. He would talk about the noise, the chaos, the smoke, and how the world changed in a single morning. He'd mention the faces he never saw again, and the small miracles that carried him forward. The smoke that drifted just when he needed it. The commander's shout through the fog, the unseen grace that let him stand up when the odds said he wouldn't. And when people asked him what he remembered most, he'd pause and look off as if seeing it all again. Then he'd say quietly, "The beach, the smell, the sound, and the promise I made to never waste the life I was given that day." Because for him, D-Day was never just a moment in history. It was a covenant between the living and the fallen, a reminder that freedom is built on the breath of those who barely made it home. And in the hush that followed Meltsu, you could almost hear the surf again.